Okay. All right, we got everything. So this morning we're going to continue in our study of Ecclesiastes. We'll finish up, and then I think I already told you, but Wednesday I'm going to be speaking at Mount Pleasant Church, which is in Bowling Green. It's up on Highway 185. So if you're bored and want something to do, come down there. And so I won't have a class online Wednesday. And then next Sunday, Mike Tenero is going to be here. It'll probably be his very first time speaking at a Presbyterian church. So uh, be gentle. No, I don't. He grew up Catholic, so it's not that far, except the Presbyterians rebelled against the Catholics, so I guess it is kind of far. Anyway, so he'll be here for me next Sunday, and then, Lord willing, then I'll be back the next week. So, um, all right, so we're going to wrap up Ecclesiastes. Actually, this is the end of the wisdom literature stuff that we're going to be looking at. Um, if we have opportunity, we'll look at Job next year, but this year, just looking into Proverbs and Ecclesiastes at the time of Solomon. As we're reading along chronologically, we get into the life of Solomon. It's thought that at least most of the Proverbs were written by Solomon. And a lot of people believe that Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, so I don't want to completely dismiss that. It's just not my personal belief. I think that there's a lot of evidence to say that someone who existed, after the time of the exile, the Babylonian captivity, that probably it was then that somebody wrote Ecclesiastes. There is evidence inside of Ecclesiastes to say that it's possibly Solomon. Regularly, he references the fact that he was, there was no king before him who enjoyed more wealth or success or wisdom. And so he references that quite a bit. The problem is, if that's Solomon speaking, then the only person he can be referring to is David. And it seems pretty unlikely to me that he's talking about his father in those terms. He could be referring to the Jebusite kings who, before David conquers Jerusalem, the people who lived in Jerusalem were the Jebusites. He could be referencing them. I just think it's very unlikely. And there's a lot of evidence, I think, within the text and outside of the text that tells us that it probably wasn't Solomon at all who wrote Ecclesiastes. It's a very pessimistic perspective. So we talked about last Sunday, Ecclesiastes is very difficult reading. It's 12 chapters of what I think are some of the hardest reading you can do. And if you have not read Ecclesiastes previously, then I would challenge you to just read through it once or twice. It takes about 45, 50 minutes to read through, and use an app on your phone, listen to it in your car, and you'll have an appreciation for the pessimism which he presents. And here's the thing is that when we look into Ecclesiastes, if it's not pessimism, then there's something else that's being taught. And it's up to us to find out what that possibly might be. So let's just go to the beginning of Ecclesiastes. And I'm just going to read just a little bit of chapter 1 just to kind of get our bearings again of how he's speaking. Remember that Ecclesiastes has two characters in the writing. So you have a guy who is called Qoheleth, which in the Hebrew just means the one who gathers, and that would have been a term that they would have used for a preacher or a teacher. And then you also have whoever the narrator is, the person who's actually doing the writing. So you have two people presented. And a lot of people for years, Jewish and Christian scholars, understood this to just be one person. But it's pretty clear from the text that it's being presented by a preacher who is not the person who is doing the writing. So here we go. Let's begin, and I'm actually going to read the better part of chapter 1, just so that you get an idea of how things are presented. Before I read this, let me just present to you the notion that when he's talking about the main word in the book of Ecclesiastes is the word vanity. Your translation may say something like meaningless, everything is meaningless, or vanity of vanities, everything is vanity. So those are the two possible translations, and neither one of those are exactly appropriate. Probably a better understanding of the word is somewhere even further than both of those. Both of those seem to imply that there's nothing worthwhile in life. And so life is filled, and he's going to go through in the next several chapters, he's going to go through and list off all those things like work and investing and building and all of the things that people spend their time doing. He's going to say it's all vanity. But the Hebrew word that he uses to describe that is called hevel. And sometimes you'll see it spelled Hebel or Hevel because they don't their consonants are not exactly equivalent to ours. But the idea of hevel is smoke or vapor. So if I were standing up here smoking a pipe and I blew out the smoke, everyone here would be able to see the smoke. And yet then it would dissipate or disappear. And so hevel can mean one of two different things. It can mean that something is fleeting, that it's going away quickly, or it can mean that it's something that's not graspable. In other words, we can't understand it. And in fact, he goes through both of those meanings in the text. And a lot of times what he says is, the more I put my heart to understand something, the less I understand. And this is a very frustrating concept that and we know this from life, that there are things that we try to grasp, there are things that we try to understand, and it seems like the more we push after that to try to get some understanding of it, the less we realize, or the more we realize we don't know. So here I am, I've come to a great understanding on some particular subject. So, those of you who, maybe work in farming, there's all this information that you have. And I even heard the discussion, Doyle and some others were talking this morning about planting and growing different crops and what's needed in the soil and all that kind of stuff. I don't know the first thing about it. My parents raised me my parents were farm kids, and they raised me outside of a farm. And we had a humongous garden that fed us and a lot of other families. And I remember weeding and hating it. That's the extent of my knowledge of farming. I hated it. And I'm not saying that I wouldn't enjoy, driving a tractor really fast. I know they're really speedy and everything. I'm sure there are components to farming that would be enjoyable to me, but gardening, hated it. And the thing is that my parents acquired a lot of knowledge and information about that to be able to be successful. I know some of you have as well. Or if you're in medicine, you've worked a long time to acquire information. Or if you're in education, or in some other practice, what you do is you achieve a certain amount of information. I don't know a whole lot about much of anything, but the two things that are sort of hobbies of mine are woodworking. Doyle and I share that. I love woodworking, but it can also be a very frustrating hobby because there's things here's a trick I wish I had known 20 years ago, and it saved me 2 hours of time. Or I love singing, and I love dealing and coaching with, and now I've lost some of my hearing in my left ear, and this is my main listening ear, and now it's become something that is totally frustrating to me. And, the groups that I work with, we've started singing again, and I can't hear things I used to hear. And here's the other part of it is that the more you know about good singing, the less you appreciate singing. And that's a problem. And so I've found myself for years sitting in congregational singing, not enjoying it because I'd informed myself too much. Have you ever found that? That you know so much about something that actually it becomes somewhat less enjoyable. And that's actually part of what is hevel. It's part of what he writes about in Ecclesiastes to say that the more information you acquire, it actually kind of ruins things for you. And you think that if I acquire this knowledge, that somehow I'll be able to make sense of it. And then you realize I'm making less sense of it. It's more irritating to me than it needs to be. And that's how Ecclesiastes is written. It's sort of, if you're frustrated by something in your life, Ecclesiastes will exacerbate that. It will highlight it and say, yeah, we've all discovered that. The more I know, the less I understand, and the less I like it. So here's the first part of the book, and it kind of tells you the way the rest of the book is going to be. So Ecclesiastes 1, verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And again, son of David refers to every son of David. Not his immediate son, but his grandsons and great-grandsons. So it can mean anyone. In the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Again, remember, that's the word hevel, and what he means is it's all smoke, it's all vapor. I can't understand it. What does man gain by the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. In other words, things that should last for people should last forever. He's actually speaking to the creative nature of God. And God creates the world. Does God care about the world? Or does he care about people? And yet, here we have an example of something that seems to work in reverse. And he's going to do this all through the book. He says, a generation comes, a generation goes, but the earth remains forever. In other words, the thing that shouldn't matter is forever. And yet, here are these people. And they come, and they live into their 70s. They live into their hundreds, and they're gone. And he's saying, I don't get it. And then he goes on, he starts speaking about things that are just part of nature that he doesn't understand. We have a better understanding of these things now. 2,500 years later, science has taught us how water works, and that it rains, and then it goes into the earth, and it evaporates, and it's a big cycle. We have a better understanding of those things now, but listen to how he describes some of these things. The sun rises, the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it rises. They didn't understand that the earth was going around the sun, and at the same time it's rotating and revolving, all that stuff. They didn't get it. And so he's saying, I've tried to understand it, and I can't. Well, that was 2,500 years ago. Verse 6, the wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. He's just talking about the nature of learning. That the more information, I see all these things are true, and I try to explain them, and it still doesn't explain it fully. And we read back to this, and we go, well, too bad you didn't live in 2021, because you would really understand all these things. No, we don't. We just think we have a better grasp. But he's struggling with just the things around him. Verse 9, what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. So here's one of the premises of the entire book, is that everything that we see is something that has already happened. And he's not talking about in terms of history. He's talking about, we have these catchphrases about learning from history. Those who not learn from history are doomed to repeat it, right? That's been, quoted over and over again by many people. And the thing is that if you have learned from history, you're doomed to repeat watching other people. You're doomed to have to sit and watch other people repeat it. So it doesn't matter if you've learned from history. You're going to experience it again because either you haven't learned or they haven't learned. And then he says, in verse 10, is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has been already in the ages before us. In other words, people come up with these, and he's not talking about technology. He's talking about ideas, understanding. And people say, oh, we know more now. Probably not. There probably was at least one civilization who got what you get. We have the ability to look into things more finitely because we have microscopes and we can analyze things and through spectrum analysis or whatever it is that we use, and so we can understand things from a more scientific perspective. And the reality is we're just as dumb as the people who lived 2,500 years ago and wrote this. We don't have more perspective. He's not talking about science. He's not talking about medicine. He's talking about the realities of life. And to that extent, do we know more? Are we practicing more? I mean, you could say you know more than your parents did. You do. I mean, you went to school to learn more than your parents did. And at the same time, do you practice more than them? And that's kind of the rubber meets the road in this book right there. So here you are with new information. Are you living like it? Or is it not having impact in your life whatsoever? probably number 2. And so he says in verse 11, there is no remembrance of former things. And you remember, one of the former things were people. We all want to think we're of significance. But in reality, 100 years from now, none of us will be here. None of us. And we will be either plotted in a grave somewhere or on a wall where they've put our ashes or whatever it is. And do you really think that people are going to look back and go, yes, my great-grandfather was preaching in this very church building? Are people going to look back at us and remember us? Do you remember your grandparents or great-grandparents? Or you might remember them because you knew them. But do you remember the people before them? Of course not. You're lucky if you even know a name. So that's why he says everything is vanity. In other words, there's just sort of a meaninglessness to it. There's a transient quality that things just go away. And unfortunately, that's true for all people. That every one of us is going to die. And facing that truth is very difficult at different stages of our life. And he's going to end the book by talking about that. So at the beginning of the book, he's really talking about just life in general. But at the end, he's going to really wrap into the problems of later things in life. He says in verse 12, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I have applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after wind. Actually, that's just a repeat phrase, isn't it? If everything is vanity, hevel, smoke, everything is smoke, it dissipates. Striving after the wind. Think about that phrase. What does it mean to strive after the wind? To chase after it, as though you could capture it. So it's a redundancy. If life is hevel, then you're trying to grasp something that can't be grasped. If you're striving after wind, you're doing the same thing. You're trying to capture something that simply can't be captured. Is that depressing? It is kind of, isn't it? He says in verse 15, what is crooked cannot be made straight. What is lacking cannot be counted. And I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my heart has great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this is also but a striving after wind. For in much wisdom is also much vexation, a word that we don't use. It just means bothersome, troubling. And he says, in much wisdom is also much vexation. And he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. This is depressing. But here's what he's going to do. He's going to spend, so the book is divided exactly in half. There are the exact same number of words in the first half, Hebrew words, as there are in the second half. There are the exact number of verse divisions in the first half as there are in the second half. And the midline for the entire thing is chapter 6 and verse 10, which is the midpoint of the entire book. And here's the thing is that what he's really trying to tell us is that what seems, to people of the world, it seems completely meaningless for us to try to acquire wisdom, for us to try to understand things. And it can be very daunting and frustrating to realize how little you know. You could have, multiple doctorates and know just such a small fraction of what there is to know. And that's kind of what he's pointing at. Is it doesn't make any difference. A lot of people think this is Solomon. I don't think it is, but let's just say it is Solomon. God gives him wisdom because he asked for something else. And so God grants him wisdom. God's own wisdom given to him. And what does he spend his time doing? He is complaining about the fact that he doesn't know anything. Isn't that incredible? Here's a guy who, you know, asked God for it and yet would come to a point. And if it is Solomon, one of the evidences that says it could be is that we know that Solomon, because of all the multiple marriages he had, also gave himself over to all kinds of idolatry. And so in your daily Bible, right before the sequence of Ecclesiastes happens, is this narration about how his multiple wives and concubines, when he marries them into his house, into his kingdom, he allows all of their idolatry to come with it. And so what's in the narration right before this is that on the east side, across the valley, on the east side of Jerusalem, he is establishing these places of worship for these foreign gods. And I told you last week, one of the very worst was Molech, who required child sacrifice. Solomon, the son of David, the one who is perhaps more loved by God than anyone, establishes places of worship for the idols of his wives. And then they practice. And among those things are, of course, child sacrifice. So he goes through in the first 6 chapters of the book, and he establishes all the things that are hevel. And he talks about, in chapter 2, he talks about the natural world. He actually talked about it a little bit in chapter 1. He talks about the way the water flows, and how the sun moves, and how the wind moves. He's talking about the natural world. Things that we understand about the natural world, it's just hevel. And no matter how much we think we understand, we don't understand any of it. He talks about wisdom and knowledge in chapter 3. And wisdom and knowledge, as much as we can accumulate, you know that you should be learning every day for the rest of your life. And even then, whatever it is that you've acquired, what is that in the grand scheme of things? It's not even a percentage of a percentage. It's so minuscule, and there's so much other information. And actually, one of the things that you sense, that especially as you get into the wisdom part of it, is you start to sense that what he's trying to say is, be humble. There's so much wisdom. There's so much information out there. You better be humble about it. So then he talks about accomplishment and accumulation and all these things that, he talks about his own personal things. Hey, look here, I've conquered kingdoms, and I've built buildings, and I've done all these great things, and it's all hevel. And it doesn't make any difference how much gold I have. It doesn't make any difference what kind of car I drive, or how big my house is, or how much money is in my bank account. Guess what? Newsflash. When you die, you take none of it. Now, that's an old quote to us. That's something, oh yeah, we already know that. That was news to them. They weren't sure about that. So 2,500 years ago, when Qoheleth is saying that to the Israelite people, oh, wait, accumulation gets us nothing? That's right, accumulation gets you zip. But we accumulate anyway. Work and labor, it's all just hevel. And then in chapter 3, he starts that whole idea of everything having an appropriate time. And it's easy for us to read in chapter 3, the first 8 verses there, it's easy for us to read that and go, yeah, there is an appropriate time for birth. But do you know what he says secondly? There's also a time to die. And we could read and say, yes, there's an appropriate time for love. And at the same time, he's arguing there's also another time for hatred. Yeah, there's a time for peace, and yet there's also a time for war. And so when he goes through these things in chapter 3, only about half the list makes sense to us. There should be a time for having fun with our friends. Oh, and there's a time for isolation too? No, well, that doesn't sound as good. And so we're kind of caught. His conclusion is that we should learn to fear God, because everything is in his hands. So if I was going to sum up Ecclesiastes, it would actually be something about that. I don't know that I have a sentence that I would try to stick all of Ecclesiastes into, but I do think that the summarization is That when you look around and you discover that everything kind of doesn't make sense, and the more sense you try to make of it, the less it makes sense, then the one thing you need to walk away with is fear God, because he's the only one that can control it all. You're trying to control your life. The reason you acquire information and wisdom is so that you can control things, so that you can manipulate time or space or matter, so that you can put things the way you want them to be, so that your life is easier, so that your life is more enjoyable. And he doesn't have any problem with us enjoying life. But he does have a problem with us trying to manipulate the things that belong to God. And what he's saying in Ecclesiastes is, all that stuff, good, acquire some of the information, and yet you control none of it. You control none of it. Allow God the space for all of that. So, we're supposed to learn to fear God because everything is in his hands anyway. And so, as I was saying in chapter 6 and verse 10, this midpoint, there's this acknowledgement that God rules over all things. And it's actually foolish of us to try to argue with his sovereign ruling, his ordering of the world. So what does he say in the second half? We got like 20 minutes to kind of establish what he says in the second half. And the second half of Ecclesiastes is more solution-driven than the first half. The first half of the book is really just an identification of all the problems in life, things that are not easy to grasp. And as he begins the second half, he starts to identify the solution. But he starts to identify the solution in chapter 7 by telling us what the actual problem is. So we've identified what the theme of Ecclesiastes is, but we haven't identified what the problem is. So he's going to in chapter 7. Let me see if I can. These have really thin pages, and I have a hard time. This is why I use a Bible on my phone most of the time. Chapter 7. Turn there. And then I could like lick my fingers like people do to get the pages turned. All right. Chapter 7 and verse 10. Chapter 7, verse 10. Say not. Yeah, that I always hate when it says stuff like say not. I mean, how about just do not say? That's not the way we speak. ESV is usually really good, but sometimes it's a little antiquated. Say not. So don't say this. Why were the former days better than these? Raise your hand if you've ever said that. I'm getting like 5 people. Raise your hand if you've ever said this in verse 10. Why was it better before now? Everyone says this. That's actually the point. Hey, don't say this. Why were the former days better than these? And he goes on, he says, for it is not from wisdom that you ask this. Oh, crud. We all kind of think we're, acting wisely if we say things like that. It used to be a lot better than this. Things aren't made the same way anymore. These kids today, that kind of argument. That's what he's talking about, right? And yet all of us have made this argument, right? And it isn't from wisdom. He's like taunting us. You're dumber than you think. But we all say this because we all think it's all corroding. It's all turning it, whatever I feared the most, that's what my kids will become. Whatever it is that, we've believed that could, possibly happen if, our country were to fail, well, that's what we're seeing all around us. And the reality is, that's what we've always seen. Your parents said the same thing. And your grandparents feared for your soul. And yet we're still saying this. Look at what he said. So our assessment is that it's our kids' fault. Because that's what he's saying is, don't say this because it's not from wisdom. What you do is you make the assessment that, well, our kids don't have enough sense to stay away from these things. So it's really, the demise of the world is because of the next generation or whatever. It's a judgment placed on other people. And yet, let me tell you what, he actually is making a point all throughout chapter 7. So look down to verse 29. Here is the climax of the judgment. See, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. All throughout chapter 7, he's arguing about the immorality of people. And especially beginning in verse 25, he's making the argument that for whatever reason, we seek after sin, the thing that separates us from God. And he says in verse 29, to summarize the entire chapter 7 is about the identification of the problem. And the problem is what? Sin. So a lot of times in our analysis, we think the problem is something that God did. And that's what he has spent the first 6 chapters saying. I can't understand life. It's all meaningless. I don't know why I should work. I'm not any better off working than people who don't work. I don't know why I should, be concerned about being, having good morals. People who don't have good morals, they seem as well off as I am. You see his argumentation? And then when he gets to chapter 7, then he identifies the problem and he says, wait a minute. Here's the real issue, is that God has made man upright. He's not talking about whether or not we stand on 2 legs, right? He's talking about morality and that God has created us to live correctly. And yet, we have sought after many schemes. Well, there it is. There's the entire problem of Ecclesiastes pinpointed. The issue for people is that we never have enough. And then the argument he's making is that even when you decide you're going to start working and you work, and then you realize that, if I just worked a little bit more, I'd have a little bit more. In other words, there's no end to work. And when you have a decent relationship and you think, I could have a little bit more of that, and then you intensify that, and then you wind up ruining things because now you're seeking after relationships that God doesn't want you to have. And all of the things that we could just deal with in life as sort of normalcy, we wind up pushing too far. And that's the schemes of men. So there's nothing wrong with wanting to have something, but there is sin and greediness. You hear that? There's nothing wrong with having a healthy understanding of the fact that God loves you. But can you go too far with that? Yeah, God loves me more than he does other people. And now I'm a racist or a bigot, or I'm greedy, or I'm selfish. You see the problem? The problem is that God has given us all these things to enjoy, and yet it's our enjoyment of those things that we take too far. And so Ecclesiastes is actually a work of wisdom to tell us, stop going too far. So, man is the source of the problem. So, let's just look at some of these verses. I'm going to just have to use my... I am faster on my phone than in a real live Bible. I know it's pathetic, but it's just how I am. All right, so Ecclesiastes 8, he's going to tell us about fearing God. So here's the thing is that we've already said that fearing God is the answer. The problem is sin, and the solution is the fear of God. So that is a carryover from the Proverbs. Proverbs talks about the beginning of wisdom is what? The fear of God. So this is nothing new under the sun. This is not some new statement. It's a repetition. So here we go. Chapter 8, verse 10. Then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place and were praised in the city. The wicked were going in and out of the holy place, and they were praised in the city where they had done such things. This also is vanity. He's talking about hypocrites. He's talking about church folk. And he describes them as wicked. Now, if this is Solomon, he's talking about himself. Here's a guy who everyone believed to be pious. And yet, when called upon to do so, he sets up a structure where kids are going to be sacrificed. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. In other words, it actually seems to be like speaking against the way we structure our legal system. sentences aren't carried out very quickly. We have an appeals process that could last 20, 25 years. By the time somebody's executed for something they did 30 years ago, it's sort of lost its punch, hasn't it? Of course, we don't deal with things in the absolute, that when God judges something, it is done. And so those judgments were executed very quickly. And we understand that. A lot of people have been executed that were innocent and vice versa. So we do have to be careful. There is discretion involved in this. At the same time, when someone's not punished quickly, there's no point to the punishment except for justice. And that's not actually one of the main purposes of punishment, according to God. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before God. So his premise here is that, you can see that there are a lot of people who are wicked, who are living well, and yet I know in my heart. So there's a difference between intellectual assent and emotional and understanding assent. And that's what he's trying to point to. I've said that people who are wicked do not get punished, and people who are righteous do. And then he says here, but I know in my heart that God is just, and that it will eventually work itself out. That's what he's saying. You understand that that's what Ecclesiastes is? It's intellectual pursuit, as opposed to being content in the Lord and saying, yeah, but I know God's just. And it seems this way. It seems that the good people, they get punished, and bad people don't. But I know in my heart of hearts that's not true. And he even goes on to say in verses 16 and 17 that we don't know God's ways because our knowledge is limited. We just don't know. It's not just our knowledge of the world, it's our knowledge of him. We're limited by everything that pertains to our brains. But he's saying we're not limited in what we know in our hearts. Now, in the Hebrew, those ideas are usually used together, but he is distinguishing between them. And he is saying that I say this as sort of a fact of life intellectually, and yet I know I'm worshiping a just God. This is what I observe, and yet I know something that goes beyond observation. And then in chapter 9, I'm going to read verses 1 through 3, just the beginning of verse 3. But all this I laid to heart, examining it all, how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hand of God. Whether it is love or hate, man does not know. Both are before him. It is the same for all, since the same event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good and the evil, to the clean and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. Do you hear the equivalency being placed on all these people? People who are good, people who are bad, people who offer sacrifice, people who don't, people who know, people who don't. Really? They're all equal? They're equal in what we perceive to be outcome. So listen. As the good one is, so is the sinner, and he who swears as he who shuns an oath. Verse 3, this is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that the same event happens to all. Also, the hearts of the children of man are full of evil, and madness is in their hearts while they live, and after that they go to the dead. So a lot of Ecclesiastes is also speaking about the place of the dead. What happens to people when they die and they're good? What happens to people when they die and they're wicked? And so a lot of it is discussion about that equality. So with all of this information that he has put together, he then challenges his readers to enjoy what parts of life they can as their circumstances allow. And so he talks about in verse 7, a lot of people take exception to this. Chapter 9 and verse 7. Go, eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. Has he? Has God approved what I do? This is something I just decide to do, then it means it meets God's approval. And a lot of people take exception to this statement. But knowing his readers are godly people, he's not talking to the world. He's not saying to the world, go do whatever your heart desires. He's talking to the people of God. This is wisdom literature for the Hebrews, who should be in a relationship with the Lord. And so if I advise you to do something, that doesn't mean that I would advise the people outside who are worldly. I don't mean outside the building, but people who are outside of the family of God. I wouldn't advise them to do the same thing. And so when he says to go and eat, God has already approved of what you've decided to do. He's talking to the people of God, and he's saying, and so there doesn't need to be an exception to this. We don't need to be offended by this, and he's telling people they can do anything they want. No, he's not. He's telling the people of God, you know what to do. You know how to live, and God has already approved that. He's told you to live that way. So there's no need to question logic. So, chapter 10. It contains all these proverbs about wisdom and foolishness that are seen in everyday life. What happens when we dig a pit? What happens when we quarry stones or when we give advice? And the answers that he gives in chapter 10 are somewhat troubling. A guy digs a pit and then he falls into it. Oh, that kind of stinks, doesn't it? Or a person quarries stones and then the stones fall on him and break his head. I mean, the things that happen in chapter 10 are like, oh, well, that's, wow, I thought we were past the negative and we were moving into better ground. No. What he's talking about is the randomness and the risk of life. And, maybe we don't quarry stones and maybe we don't dig pits anymore. But here's what we do. We take risks every day. And sometimes the risks work against us. Sometimes things, you took a risk and you failed. I mean, I've done that so many times, I kind of am gun shy about taking a risk anymore. And it's like, you get hit enough times. I took a risk. I guess I'm an idiot. And I took a risk and then it failed. And it almost ruined me. And now what do you do? Well, in chapter 10, he's telling you, this is just part of life. It's not an evaluation of you. It's just part of life, that there are risks associated with every decision that we make. And so again, he's trying to push us to focus on the one who creates life. And that's how the book ends. In chapters 11 and 12, what he does is he pushes us to remember our Creator. So let's go over, I'm just going to skip to the end here and talk about chapter 12 really quickly. There we go. Chapter 12. Yeah, I'm going to read verses 1 through 7. So, this is how he wraps everything up. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return after the rain, in the day when the keepers of the house tremble. So, he's going to use language that we should be able to understand. He's talking about getting old. And he's going to say getting old isn't going to be fun. And there are all kinds of things that are going to begin to fail because we get old. And the keepers of the house, your hands and your arms and your legs. He's going to talk about your eyes. You're going to stop seeing as well. Your body isn't going to function the way that it used to. How does he begin this entire discussion? Go back to verse 1. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth. Start out life well by remembering that God created you, and end life even better by remembering that God created you. And as much as if you have the right perspective, you can almost sort of laugh and joke about the beginning and the end of life. There are miserable parts of it. There's no denying that. And yet, see it from God's perspective. He made you. He created you. And so when these things begin to fail, remember your Creator. Before, in verse 2, before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return after the rain. In the days when the keepers of the house tremble, and the strong men are bent, and the grinders cease because they are few teeth, and those who look through the windows are dimmed, and the doors on the street are shut, when the sound of the grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of a song are brought low. This would take some pretty incredible hearing aids for some older person to be able to hear the sound of a bird in the morning. But he's saying it can't happen. And he says they are afraid also of what is high, and terrors are in the way. The almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails, because man is going to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. Before the silver cord is snapped, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Everything is hevel. Everything. And here's the thing is, you're fortunate if this is your end. You're fortunate. My mom would have turned 79 on Friday. 79. She lived to 52 years and 3 months. That's incredible. That's sobering for me. It's 25 years that she missed. She has 20-something grandkids. She never met a single one. So here's my point in saying that is that you look at this list and you think, oh, the grinders fail and there's nobody looking out the windows and all this stuff, and it's all bad. Or you can change your perspective and say, I got to live life. You understand that? Because if you don't, then that's even more sorry. It's way better to live and to see things, even if you can't see them as well, and you can't hear them as well, and you don't experience life with the same desire and the same fullness that you used to have. It's still better from an earthly perspective. And yet we understand Paul would say that from a heavenly perspective, Paul would write to the Philippians and say, I'm torn. I want to be here for you so that I can serve you and help you, but man, I want to go on to be with the Lord. That's difficult. And yet you see both of them are truth. That I kind of want to go on. And I would miss out on some things, but I'm not really missing out on it. And so that's what you see how it's like this paradox. It's like I can choose that and I can choose that and they're both okay. That's what he says. It's hevel. It's like there's not really necessarily a right answer to this. And that's frustrating because we want what's knowable. And it isn't always knowable. We're going to take the communion. And I just want to tell you something before we take the communion. Go ahead and get your foam bread out. Ecclesiastes is this sort of negative perspective, and yet you might read through it and say it's a realist's perspective. That this is just how life is. And I don't know how we're split on that. I don't know if we're equal, if there's 50% of us who think of this as, yeah, Ecclesiastes is exactly right. Or, maybe there's 80% of us. I don't know. But there's another percentage of us who read through it and go, wow, this is too negative for me. I can't take it. I read through Ecclesiastes and I'm like, that's the truth. This is absolutely the truth. That things are just kind of miserable sometimes, and there's nothing I can do or say that's actually going to change that. That's just the way it is. So I consider myself a realist. I consider myself not a pessimist, but a realist who just accept that life kind of stinks. And that there's a lot about it that's not enjoyable. And yet there are lots of things listed in Ecclesiastes that are awesome. Enjoy those. Enjoy eating and hanging out with friends. Go out to eat. Have your friends over for a meal. Those are enjoyable things. The birth of a child. The times of peace. Economic you know, great times where you're not worried about your job. You're not worried about your money. You know, those are all great things. Enjoy them. And yet, there's this component of this that is what we perceive as the negative side. And let me put it into two words: fear God. Because that's kind of the negative side of Ecclesiastes. Like, oh, you mean I have to do something? I have to fear God? Do you know what the word fear lines up with in the rest of Scripture? Turn to John 14. We're going to look at one last thing, and we'll take the communion together. John 14. In verse 15. Now he said this already in chapter 13. So John 12, 13, 14, that's the Last Supper that Jesus eats with his disciples. And there was an event, so they sit down to the table to eat together. And do you remember there's something that Jesus does? Just go ahead and say it out loud if you can remember. What does Jesus do? Because none of the other disciples had done it. They're all laying at the table, right? And they lay on their left side and eat with their right. And so their heads, they don't sit at a table, they lay at the table. And their heads and their abdomen are all right next to each other, and their feet lay out the back. And the custom was that when you entered someone's home, they washed your feet because you picked up all the dirt and the stink of the road. And Jesus and his disciples are laying there, and none of them, they're in a hostless house. There is no host to wash their feet. They're upstairs in somebody's house. There's nobody there. Well, Jesus is the host. And so he gets up, and he girds himself, which means he basically takes the back part of his belt and pulls it through the dress part of what he's wearing and girds it into the front part of his belt so that his robe functions more as pants. And then he takes the basin and the towel and he begins to wash the disciples' feet. And in the process of doing that, he says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another." And he gets to Peter, and Peter says, you're never going to wash my feet. Because Peter knows who he is. The other disciples maybe don't understand that yet. And he says, you're never going to wash my feet. And he says, well, then you're never going to be part of my kingdom. And Peter says, well, give me a bath then. And so Jesus washes his feet and he moves on. And he even washes the feet of Judas Iscariot, who he knows has already purposed in his heart to sell Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver, a slave's cost. And he washes the disciples' feet, and he comes back, and then he sits back down, and he starts to teach them, and he says in chapter 14, verse 15, if you love me, you will keep my commands. This is a strong, I don't think, people like to do like object lessons. You do an object lesson because you get people invested in what you're saying. They're paying attention to something else, and then, there's a point to this something else. There's no stronger object lesson than Jesus. And maybe they didn't get it right then, but think about what they would come to understand later. That on the night that he's being betrayed, before the morning he's crucified and dies, he is girding himself and crawling around the outside of the disciple circle and washing their feet. It would never, ever leave them. And he only basically is telling them one thing. All of the sermoning that he does in this chapters 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, all of that is, guess what? If you love me, you're going to do as I command you. And here's the thing is, it's not even what he commands. It's what he does. Ecclesiastes is written in this really negative way, but the point of it is to learn to fear God. That's what Jesus is teaching. It's fear. has an equivalent in love. If you love me, you will do what I say. In the Old Testament, it's termed as fear God, do what he says. Jesus sort of rearranges that. Is there a fear of God? Absolutely there is. At the same time, he also puts keeping his commands on love. That love is the thing that pushes us to do that. And so I just want to challenge you that as you read through Ecclesiastes or you read through wisdom literature and it tells you you're supposed to do something, you're supposed to live a certain way and understand things a certain way, you do that because you love and fear him. You respect and honor him. So this week, you can't live like you did last week because you remember. You know you did something. And it's something that we don't really talk about. You know, whatever it is, you were proud, you were greedy, you did something last week, don't do it this week. And pray for God's strength that you won't. We remember the supper. We eat the supper to remember somebody who never failed in the ways that we do. So we eat his body, we drink his blood to just remember, to remind ourselves that it is possible. It is possible to live correctly, to live righteously. We just don't do it. Let's pray. God, thank you for the body of Jesus that reminds us that all of the punishment was borne in him, that we have taken none of it for ourselves. Everything that we've done that deserved justice was all beaten in him, that he bore our iniquities and the brunt of all of the hardship because of our sin. And we thank you that we don't have to. In Jesus' name, amen. God, we thank you for the blood of Jesus that came from his body, that washes away our sin and removes our iniquity from us. And we pray that we will live lives this week that reflect that we are born again into the image of God, that we can reflect Jesus into the world and not our own sinful selves. And we're thankful that we have been recreated and redeemed for a purpose because of his blood. Amen. Okay. I hope Ecclesiastes isn't so negative that it's depressing to you. I hope that you see that there's a point to the teaching and that it's actually a very positive point. That we are supposed to be so in touch with God and his teaching that it leaves us no choice. And hopefully you live a life that's transformed this week because of that. It's good to see the Browns. Good to see y'all. And I don't know if I'm seeing any other new faces. Not really. People we've all seen. Sorry, you guys are just sort of old hat now. It is good to see everybody. And what? Oh! Well, she's sitting behind Doyle. Doyle's a giant. I couldn't see her. Sorry. See you. Good to see you, Charlotte. Doyle's head is like totally blocked. Huh? They've been here. You just haven't been here enough, Johnny. It is good to see y'all. Okay, so the building stuff. I know we say this. It's like, oh, we need to give it up in prayer, and the reality is we need to be doing that the whole time, right? And I think what Vernita was saying. I mean, nobody disagrees with that. That's exactly the truth. That we are not identified by a building. You know, we are a church, we are a family, and I think this proves it. I mean, here we are meeting, and we've invited Johnny to play drums for us, and he hasn't done it a single time. But here we are meeting in sort of a foreign place, and yet, you know, we meet together and we enjoy time together, and right, you know, and yeah, I agree. I think we're all a little bit concerned about that. But remember people you haven't seen in a while. Try to catch up with them, and we're trying to get things resolved. It has been stressful from all vantage points. But it's not like nobody's aware of it. Trying to get it fixed. We just don't know the right step. And of course, when the government steps in, everything gets perfectly done. So, and we all know that. So, anyway, thank you all for being with us. And I won't be here for about a week or so, but Tanero will be here next Sunday. And he asked me the main reason he's coming up here is because he wanted to see you guys. So, and I told him, I was like, why don't you start coming up regularly, and but he's coming up next Sunday, and we won't be here, but it'll be good to hear about it anyway. So, yeah. Okay. Yeah, first time parenting can be nerve-wracking, right? I saw that. That's great. Guys too. Guys too. Yeah. Johnny, remember that. That's great. Yeah, we're proud of you too. That it is. It's very to step out on your own. It's a little bit nerve wracking, but you got friends. They'll take care of it. Maybe. That's great. Okay. Well, let's dismiss with a prayer. Greg Jr., you want to dismiss us?
Father in heaven, we come before you, thanking you for the beautiful Lord's Day, the opportunity to gather here together as like-minded Christians to worship the Lord and our Christ. To do so in the fashion that you've instructed us. Father, we thank you for the good lesson today, the timeless lessons that are in your Bible. Guide our life every day, and no end to the application when we slow down and think of your instruction. Father, for the sick and the afflicted, the nervous about to be parents, all those that have been mentioned today, we ask that you give them your hope, your peace, your comfort through the coming week. As we go out and about and move through our daily lives, watch over us, bring us back together. In Christ's name I pray. Amen.
Amen.